Good afternoon and welcome to the latest IEA Clean Coal Centre webinar. My name is Andrew Minchener and I will be giving a presentation today on energy issues for Mongolia. Now, just before I get into the presentation proper, I would like to point out that you can post questions for me at any time using the questions button at the top of the screen in front of you, and I will then attempt to answer them at the end of the presentation. This presentation is in fact based on a recent study that I have undertaken, which is just about to be published by the Centre. The scope of the report is shown in this slide, and I will be giving an overview of it on what is in fact a very complex situation. And whereas I will focus on the coal issues, I will not just be covering technical issues, but very much the policy, regulatory and geopolitical issues that are all having a major impact on exploitation of coal reserves and other mineral resources within Mongolia. This is a schematic of Mongolia. It shows a very sparse country with in fact very few cities. It's a landlocked nation between Russia and China, and it's the 19th largest country in the world, but has a population of just about 2.7 million people. Now, over half of these live in and around the capital city, which is Ulaanbaatar, and some 50% of the remainder are still nomadic, reflecting the traditional lifestyle of Mongolia in the past. Of the other cities shown here, unlike Ulaanbaatar, most of them measure their populations in the tens of thousands. In terms of geography, this varies considerably from mountains and rivers in the northwest of the country to lower-lying desert towards the south of the country, which in fact accounts for about 41% of the land area. It is very cold for much of the year, and for example, Ulaanbaatar has an average annual temperature of just under -3 Celsius. The other point to stress, and it will come up several times in the presentation, is that in this large landlocked country with few people, there is in fact a minimal infrastructure with few roads and even fewer railways. This gives a couple of photographs of different aspects of Mongolia. On the left, we have a view of one of the coal-fired combined heat and power plants in Ulaanbaatar. This is inefficient and polluting, as indicated in the picture. It also, and very importantly, shows the shanty town or gur area that is building up around the city. Now, many of the nomads that I referred to earlier have given up their traditional lifestyle and are building more permanent structures on the edge of Ulaanbaatar and other cities. The problem is there are minimal amenities available to them, such as power, water and sanitation at present. And this increasing urbanisation, or at least this approach to increasing urbanisation, is creating major social problems. In contrast, the picture on the right shows much of what the southern part of Mongolia looks like. Put it simply, there's nothing there, or perhaps it would be more appropriate to say there's nothing there, at least on the surface. A little bit more background, a little bit of history. Mongolia was a famous independent nation until about the mid-1700s, when it was incorporated into Imperial China by the Emperor Qianlong as part of his expansionist plans, and it then remained a part of Imperial China until the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911. Over the next 9 years, Mongolia sought and was successful, ultimately in 1920, in breaking away from China and forming an independent nation, whereupon it was immediately subjugated by the Soviet Union, who ran it as a satellite country for the next 60 years until in fact the Soviet Union collapsed. At that point, a new independent nation was established, a democratic nation with open elections, and indeed has been establishing the basis of a market economy since that time. Well, that's good, but why would anyone actually be interested in what has been a bit of a nation backwater? And that's simply because in recent years, massive quantities of coal and indeed massive quantities of precious metals and other minerals have been discovered, and the country is possibly just possibly on the brink of a mining boom. However, given the lack of facilities, lack of infrastructure in the country, there are many challenges to overcome first. Not least, as I put here, the GDP is very small in this country. In 2010, the national GDP was $6 billion US. So that if this country is going to develop, it's going to be very dependent on international financing and indeed on international expertise, particularly in the mining sector. However, there is a lack of awareness, there are inconsistent policies, and there's a very weak legal and regulatory system, all of which are causing major problems as the country tries to grow the economy. This slide gives an overview of the energy resources and reserves at the end of 2009, which was compiled by BGR of Germany. Several points to highlight here. The energy resources are dominated by coal. We can see here that the total coal resources was, at the end of 2009 is given as about 160 gigatons, 160 billion tons. And at that time, the quantified, technically and economically recoverable reserves were given at about 2.5 gigatons. I should stress that the country is still not fully explored. There are massive exploration and quantification programs going on. And indeed, in subsequent slides, you'll see much higher levels given for those reserves. There's no conflict between these numbers and the later ones. The later ones just reflect what's happened in the last 3 years or so. There is very limited oil production, in fact so limited that it's not economic to have a refinery in the country, and all the crude oil that's extracted is actually sold direct to China, while Mongolia imports all its oil products, petrol and diesel and lubricants, from Russia. There are significant uranium resources, but no plans yet to exploit them, and there is very significant wind and solar power potential, problem being that this potential is often in regions of the country that are particularly remote, and so there's no real means, because of the limited electricity transmission grid system, of getting that power to parts of the country where it's needed. So the potential for wind and solar is significant, but it's yet to be realized. Mongolia clearly recognizes it needs to exploit its mineral wealth if its economy is to grow. And the government wants to use the proceeds from that growth to improve the general well-being of the people, particularly through better health, care and better education at all levels. They have very ambitious, or perhaps it would be better to say overly optimistic, top-level plans, and if these plans are to be achieved, as I've suggested already, but it's worth repeating, it will require major infrastructure development and an influx of specialist assistance plus funding. This slide shows some of the key objectives. They currently import a certain amount of electricity from Russia. This is both expensive and politically unreliable, and there's a wish to eliminate that problem by ensuring that all domestic consumers can be supplied with domestically produced electricity. There's a recognition that they need to introduce economies of scale and great efficiency into the power sector, both for the transmission and distribution grids, as well as the heat and power supply technologies themselves. There's very clear plans to enhance the use of renewable energy, both for centralized and off-grid applications, such as large-scale PV systems, perhaps in the Gobi desert region, and certainly large-scale wind farms. One major success they've had here is the introduction of smaller-scale but portable PV systems that have been distributed free to all of the nomadic families within the country, thereby giving them a local power source, which is particularly beneficial. And there's a recognition that if the mining industry is to grow, that will need to be serviced not just with power and electricity, but other services as well. And there's a need to incorporate that into the overall plans. And there are some suggestions, not advanced particularly far, that they will look to build some large-scale coal-fired power plants solely to export electricity to China. This is a very complicated slide which is showing the grid systems within Mongolia. I would suggest you focus on the three electricity grid systems here, which are the solid red lines in the west of the country, the much larger one in the central part of the country, and then a somewhat smaller one to the eastern side of the country. The capacity of the one in the west is very small at 12 megawatts, and most of that is electricity imported from Russia. The grid system, the central grid system, is much larger. It has a capacity of about 646 megawatts, and it's basically dominated by coal-fired heat and power schemes. It is also, in fact, that accounts for about 95% of all power production within the country. Then there is a rather smaller, much smaller eastern grid system, which is 36 megawatts, essentially based around one coal-fired heat and power scheme. There is also, not clearly shown here, there is also a very, very tiny grid system, the Altai-Uliastai system, which is in the remote part of the western provinces, and eventually it's a system that links together a number of diesel-fired generators in some of the more remote communities. There are some blue dotted lines on this slide, and they are a representation of a possible linking of the grids, which is an overall objective of the government by 2030. And there's also a suggestion of a possible extension of the grid system into the South Gobi desert region, where many of the mining prospects are to be based. So big challenges here in putting together an integrated, comprehensive grid system for the country as a whole. This slide shows the coal-fired power plants that are linked into the central energy system. There's 3 from Ulaanbaatar, units 2, 3 and 4, and 1 each from the cities of Darkhan and Erdenet, which are relatively close to Ulaanbaatar. There's several points to stress here. The units are by and large smallish, or at least 4 of them are smallish. They're all pretty old, they're all inefficient, and they're all unreliable. From a power point of view, you can see the theoretical capacity would be over 800 megawatts. In fact, it can best achieve 646 megawatts, in part because of large internal power consumption, and in part because the load factors that can be reliably achieved are really quite low. The other point to stress is that if these power plants do fail, there will be a loss of heat as well as power. And in the extreme weather conditions that this country has in the winter, that could literally prove fatal for a large amount of the population. The other point to stress is that these units are polluting, burning the local lignite, though I think it's also fair to say that the pollution in the winter mostly arises from the Gur dwellings, where they burn all sorts of low-grade coal and rubbish on very inappropriate small boiler systems and heater systems. This slide gives a historical perspective of power supply against demand, and then some provisional projections for the future. The slide on the left, or the diagram on the left, shows how power demand has been met essentially by the coal-fired combined heat and power plants plus imports and a little bit of renewables. And the picture on the right shows how the overall capacity might have to increase should all the projections about minerals mining, coal mining and general increasing in availability of power and heat to the country are introduced over the next 25 years. The point to stress here is that the blue region at the bottom is the possible growth of the central energy system due to primarily to urbanization, increased urbanization. The other grid systems don't really grow very much, but then there is also a potentially massive growth, which is shown in yellow, which would be the power and heat demand or power demands for the South Gobi region should the mining prospects reach fruition. The key word there is should they reach fruition. Right, Now moving on to coal itself. This is again another schematic of Mongolia and showing the 15 coal basins within the country. Lignite is shown here as in basins 7 to 15, shown as a sort of muddy brown colour on the slide, and you can see that by and large the lignite is found in the northern and eastern parts of the country. In contrast, the hard coal deposits, which is shown as a sort of golden colour, are in basins 1 to 6 and are in the west and south of the country. Particularly important is the South Gobi region, basin 6, in part because this is so close to the Chinese border. I think just to put this slide in context, within these 15 basins, some 300 coal deposits have been found, of which only about 80 have been explored and quantified. So as I indicated earlier, the expectation in terms of technically and economically viable coal reserves are going to grow considerably from the numbers that I was showing earlier. Just picking up on the South Gobi region, this is just highlighting some of the major potential mining deposits in the south of the country. You can see 5 sort of circles right down in the South Gobi region, which are seen as potentially significant coal mines, again with the potential for export into China and possibly beyond. They are also of special interest because they contain not just hard coal, thermal coal, but they also contain significant quantities of coking coal. And in this regard, Tavan Tolgoi is of particular importance. It has proven coal reserves of about 6 gigatons, of which 2 gigatons is prime coking coal, for which there is a very significant global demand. This slide shows the potential major coal mines in southern Mongolia, which is based on or extracted from a World Bank study undertaken in 2009. This shows that these mines could be long life mines, can have a high annual production with a cumulative production of certainly in excess of 50 million tonnes a year. I think the other point to stress is that on the basis of this study back in 2009, most of these mines should either be operational, because they would all be open cast mines, so the development time is not too great. So they should either be operational or well under development, and in fact none of them have got to that stage as yet. A key potential mining point here is Tavan Tolgoi. This is the mine with the big coking deposits, for which there's a big market. It's state-owned, as all minerals are in Mongolia, but the government tried to sell on the mining rights so that they could bring in investment to exploit and develop the mine. It held a competition, a winner was selected, and then Parliament blocked this from happening due to concerns about the benefit that Mongolia would receive from the deal that was being proposed. The government then tried to introduce an international public offering of 50% of the shares, and more very worthily, it made a certain proportion of this equity available to the public as free shares. It then ran into other problems. As part of the election last year, it bought up the free shares from the public, and this has then run into cash flow problems for the mine, and indeed has actually stopped any development work getting underway in what should be a major earning opportunity for the country. So a number of problems here with a rather inconsistent changes in approach by the government. This just emphasises that point. This shows how coal production was expected to increase steadily, and as I'll show in the next slide it has, but then there was expected to be a big step up from about 2010, and especially from 2012, as some of these major mines came on stream. And while the increase has been quite substantial, starting from a very low base, it is now running well below projections. This slide shows the actual coal production from the year 2000 through to the year 2011. Now, from 2000 to 2004, only lignite was produced for domestic use, heat and power, and some small industrial production. From 2005 onwards, the total production increased, in fact increased a lot, and this was due to certain coking coal production coming online, and all of that coking coal being exported to China. In fact, by 2011, they were exporting about 25 million tonnes of prime coking coal into China, generating significant revenue. The expectation was that in 2012, the overall production level would be about 41 million tonnes, with around about 35 million tonnes of coking coal being exported. But by end of August last year, only 17 million tonnes had been produced, of which only 11 had been exported. And this representation of what had been impressive growth collapsing in on itself was in part due to disputes between Mongolia and China, and also due to some of the government decisions of which I touched on earlier. It's not all bad news, I guess. One thing is certainly true: coal production is low cost in Mongolia. Not just is all the coal suitable for open cast mining, which is relatively low cost. A lot of the coal is very close to the surface. This shows part of the open cast mine at Bougainville, which is about a 2 hours drive from Ulaanbaatar. Extraction costs for the coal are about $10 a ton. The picture on the left shows the fact that there's an overburden of about 20 meters or so, 20 to 30 meters. Below that there is a coal seam, lignite in this case, of about 20 meters. There's another layer of rock below that, maybe 20, 30 meters. Another coal seam, similar breadth to the one shown here. And then if you really wanted it, there's down at about 100 meters, which is well within the range for open cast production, there is a third seam. From a Mongolian point of view, it's not cost effective to mine more than the top two seams, which are very accessible. So in fact, once the top two seams are mined out, they're leaving the third deeper seam in situ. Indeed, they're undertaking restoration once the mining is completed in parts of the overall field, which is a commendable thing to do. The other point to stress: this mine is about 15 kilometers square, massive thing. The coal, once extracted, is loaded into trucks, where it is then taken on a single gauge railway back to Ulaanbaatar and the other cities, where, as I indicated earlier, it supplies the combined heat and power plants in particular. When one thinks or looks back over the situation in Mongolia, with hindsight, and hindsight of course is a wonderful thing, the Mongolian government had been rather naive about the requirements it applied to its mining licenses, and in some cases it was, to put it bluntly, ripped off. This has resulted, if you like, in a pendulum effect where, having had a rather laissez-faire attitude to its mining licensing, there is now a swing of the pendulum and a call for much tighter regulation and control, and indeed ensuring that Mongolia gets a greater proportion of the proceeds arising from that mining. There was a populist government elected in the summer of last year, which has picked up on these points very strongly and is publicly stating that all mining contracts will be looked at and possibly renegotiated, which of course, if you're an international investor, is one of the last things you want to see happen. At the same time, and this timing was really not helpful, one of the Chinese state companies, Chalco, Chinese Aluminium Company, tried to buy the companies that own the mining rights to a number of the coking deposits close to the Chinese border in order to secure the coking coal for China. This immediately led to retrospective legislation being put in place to prevent this happening. Essentially, coal and a number of other minerals and a number of other aspects of the Mongolian economy were declared as strategic assets, and this made them illegal to be for an overseas company to have majority shares in these assets. Rather very similar, in fact, to the situation in Australia and Canada. Consequence of all this is, whereas in the past, very recently in the past, finance houses and mining companies were almost falling over one another to get a slice of the action in Mongolia, it is now seen very much as a risky investment opportunity just at the time that it needs that investment. The other point to stress is it's a landlocked country, and at the moment it's selling its coking coal into China at about $50–$55 a tonne, essentially cost price when you take the extraction and transport costs into play. If it could get its coal beyond either Russia or China into the other Asian markets, particularly Japan and South Korea, it could be looking at very much higher prices than that, maybe $200–$220 a tonne. But of course, if it's going to do that, it's got to have an agreement with either one or both of its neighbours to transport coal across their territory to the coastal ports. The World Bank again did a study of this in 2009, and they suggested that if 20 million tonnes could be exported across China, then selling on to Japan and South Korea, Mongolia could realise a profit from those 20 million tonnes of about $1.85 billion. If instead of going via China, they went via Russia, which would be a much longer route, it would still be a profitable exercise, but the profit would only be $400 million. Either way, Mongolia has to reach an accord with either China or Russia, or both, if it's going to really realise high profits on its minerals. I have a further cautionary note. The expectation has always been that Mongolia, after the finding of these massive coal deposits, would become a major player in the international coal trade, particularly with regard to coking coal. The fact that China's mining plan is essentially stalled and its exports have not been reaching the suspected levels has left a vacuum in that international market, which is being filled by competitors. In particular, the USA is becoming a major exporter of coal, particularly to Asia, both thermal coal and coking coal. Now, this has arisen because of its embrace of shale gas and natural gas-fired units. This has meant that much of the coal production is no longer needed for domestic use, but because of the port and infrastructure systems in the USA, it's rapidly and readily becoming a major exporter of this surplus coal to Asia at very competitive prices. Indeed, the indications are that Mongolia's coking coal is still likely to remain competitive, but its thermal coal may well find it a major challenge because it has a lower price, lower international price than the coking coal, and while Mongolia's extraction costs and mining costs of its coal are very low, its transport costs at present, at least, are very high. So there's a further concern for the country. Briefly, I just want to say a very little about the introduction of cleaner energy technologies into Mongolia. There is a new combined heat and power plant going to be built, which is based on a circulating fluidized bed combustion technology. A winning consortium has been announced, and providing they can establish a 25-year power plant power price agreement with the government, they will build 3 CFBC units to have an electrical capacity of 415 megawatts and a heat output of just under 600 megawatts thermal. There's plans for an additional lignite-fired power plant in Altan Shiri, close to the south, what will be the South Gobi mining region. Expectation is that this will be 600 megawatts, but there's also interest in a polygeneration approach, which would require gasification technology and certainly would require international cooperation. And in fact, there's a feasibility study with a potential international vendor underway at present. The other thing to highlight is coal liquefaction. for the production of synfuels such as petrol and diesel. Currently, Mongolia buys its petrol and diesel from Russia at about $1,000 to $1,100 per tonne. That is both expensive and again politically unreliable. Studies have been undertaken that show the introduction of coal liquefaction technologies would mean that petrol and diesel could be produced between $600 and $650 a tonne, which is an attractive option to Mongolia. There's various license agreements being established between ThyssenKrupp Uhde, for example, and major industrial companies in Mongolia, and there's also interest at an earlier stage by Japan and South Korea. Finally, just to highlight the wind farm that's being established close to Ulaanbaatar. This is being built by Newcomb, which is a leading Mongolian conglomerate, and it's being developed by them with international support. If successful, they will build more. And finally, there's publicly been declared there is no interest in nuclear power in the country at present. The way forward, I think as I've hopefully indicated, Mongolia has tremendous potential based primarily on its coal mining and other minerals extraction opportunities. But it does face enormous challenges, both to establish these mining-based commercial initiatives, while at the same time seeking to establish a more sustainable long-term future for the country and its people, trying to avoid the mining-based boom or bust that's happened to some other resource-rich countries in the past. There are also some social development issues which I haven't had time to touch on, but these also need to be fully addressed. Finally, knowledge transfer. This is very important. Not only are there not many people in the country, the very great majority have little understanding of coal extraction, minerals extraction, clean coal technology, and so forth. And I think introducing that knowledge is necessary both to assist the nation in its near-term development plans, but also to build up the national capacity from a longer-term sustainable perspective. So it's not just helping the industrial companies in the near term, it's putting in place programs that will allow the country to build up its knowledge at the secondary and tertiary educational levels. And in a personal opinion, I think this is something where there should be a role to help from the IEA Clean Coal Centre. So, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found the presentation of interest. The report which it's based on will be publicly available in the very near future, and I hope many of you get the opportunity to read it. If you have any questions that you haven't raised already, you can still raise them now via the on-screen facility. But if you think of them later and want to ask me about them, then you can contact me via the email address that's shown on this slide. So that brings me to the end of the presentation, and thank you very much for listening, and I'll now see what questions have been raised. Thank you. I have two questions here. The first one is about Tavan Tolgai, and it says, I have read recently in the press about problems at the Talgan Toigoi mine. Could you comment on the story? Certainly, I'd be very happy to do that. I appreciate I rushed through it, and it is rather a complicated story. As I indicated, Talgan Toigoi is a major is a coal field with major coking and thermal coal deposits, which in particular there is a wish to exploit the coking coal deposits because of the big market opportunities. All coal is owned by the state, and the state has established a company called Erdenes Tavan Tolgoi, which is to control the development of this coal deposit. The intention has always to be that they would sell the mining rights in a way that Erdenes Tavan Tolgoi would become a partner with whatever consortium bought the rights, and in that way would have a share of the revenue arising whereas the consortium itself would put the development costs and undertake the development of the mine. So it's a mechanism whereby the country gets a return on the fact that it's offering its resources for exploitation by external companies. It tried through this consortium route, but for the reasons that there was this sort of pendulum swing back, even though they held a reasonable competition and chose a winning consortium, the state parliament rejected that on the basis that it didn't think it was a good enough deal for the country. We then had this initial public offering, subsequently had this international public offering, and then at the last election, the incumbent government actually gave free shares from this offering to all of the people within Mongolia, and then offered, and in fact did buy them back from those people where they wanted to sell them, in which case, in most cases, everyone did. But they drew the money from that from a Denis Tavan Tolgoi company, which actually essentially bankrupted the company. And that company had some contracts in place with China for supplying certain amounts of coal from some of the easy access deposits. It was paying a company to stockpile the coal at the border. It no longer had any money to do that. It then had to renege on the contract, and is now trying to negotiate with a loan from the government to buy out the remainder of its contract with China. And this is in part why the coal production collapsed last year. How it will go from here remains to be seen. It still appears that there's planning to be an international public offering, but as I've indicated, that position could change very rapidly. I hope that gives you a bit more about it. There's a lot more about it, I should say, within the report. Question, do I have any information on the rail and road infrastructure for coal exports? Yes, I do. For the domestic activities where they're mining lignite for use in the cities, in the power and heat schemes in the city, as I indicated, that's taken by a single track railway from the mine, Baganur, and taken into Ulaanbaatar and the other cities. Down in the south of the country, where they are mining a certain amount of export coal, most of that, in fact almost all of that, is being taken by truck to the border, where it's transferred to the Chinese, and in some parts transferred on by truck to one of the Chinese rail lines. That is both expensive and environmentally damaging. All these trucks taking significant loads of coal is creating major dust problems in that part of the country, affecting what vegetation there is. And it's also cutting across the migratory routes of a lot of the indigenous animals in that part of the country, which is creating further problems. So ultimately, if a deal is to be struck, there's going to have to be railroads constructed in that part of the country. But again, that will require resources and deals being put in place to ensure that the decent coal export deals can be established. Question, is the hard steam coal separated from coking coal at a preparation plant or mined separately from a different deposit? At present, it's mined separately from different deposits. For example, in Tavan Tolgoi, there are 6 major coal blocks, one of which is a coking coal block, and the other 5 are hard coal. So where coal is currently mined from Tavan Tolgoi, that is being achieved from a different deposit to the thermal coals. And where there's some coal going across the Chinese border on the western side of the country, it's on exactly the same basis. Final question, have you had a chance to look at the new draft law on minerals, and what is your take on this draft? I have to say, I'm afraid, I haven't had a chance to look at that yet, but I'm in quite close contact with a number of people in Mongolia, and so this is something I will certainly be looking at in the near future. If you have been in the south of Mongolia, this is the next question, where the mining sectors are centred, Can you please kindly tell us about the social aspects of this sector to the local people and how locals see this development, and is there any conflict in social and cultural aspects? That's a big question. I'll do my best to answer it in the time remaining. I haven't been to South Mongolia. I have spoken in a lot of detail both with mining people and people in the UN and other people resident in the country when I visited Mongolia last year for what proved a very informative visit. As I indicated in one of the earlier questions, there are problems with shipping the coal from the mining areas, open cast mines, to the border by truck, and that could be alleviated by a rail link being put in, but it hasn't yet happened for the reasons I've been referring to. I think I have asked these sort of questions with the UN and others. I think the general situation of the local people is that they are really quite small communities, and if you then end up with a massive influx of outsiders, and mostly from outside of the country, setting up a mining community near to your small community, certainly the system doesn't seem able to accommodate that at present. There are all sorts of social issues regarding drink, women, and other aspects which would need to be addressed. It hasn't happened yet because the mining boom hasn't taken off, and this is certainly something that's recognised by the UNDP and others. The other point is that people also then do take a pragmatic view. This isn't great, but it is bringing us some revenue and it is bringing us some jobs, so it must be said that it doesn't bring too many jobs. The government has tried to address this issue by setting up a social fund for the population as a whole, which is to be funded by revenues from the mining activities, whether it be coal mining, precious metal mining or minerals mining. And they set up what they called the Human Development Fund. And the idea was to bring Mongolia's human development status up to the same level as that of the developed countries by 2020. Initial funding was drawn from the Uvo Tolgoi gold and copper mine project, and then also bringing in money from Tavan Tolgoi. There's been a lot of consultation on how best to use this fund, and the general feeling it should be used to improve basic access to, to improve access to basic services, to improve housing conditions, reduce inequality in life expectancy, and raise material standards of living. And also maintain environmentally sustainable income flows to meet Mongolia's most significant development challenges. That's fine. Unfortunately, at the time of the last election, the incumbent government used most of the funds to provide a cash payment to all of the public. I couldn't possibly comment on why that should be, but this effectively emptied the fund, and we're now in the situation with the coal exports more or less collapsing, that there's not been any top-up of that fund as yet. So I think a short answer to your question after having rambled for a few minutes, the social aspects are significant, and there is a need, and they're certainly starting to arise as this mining activity is starting to move forward. How it's going to pan out remains to be seen, and it certainly is an area where many of the aid agencies and others operating within that country have considerable concerns. That appears to be the questions, and we're just about out of time. So I'd like to remind you that the next Clean Coal Centre webinar will be on Wednesday the 13th of March, and this will cover coal mine site reclamation and will be presented by Dr. Leslie Sloss. Again, thank you very much for tuning in to my webinar. I again hope you found it of interest, and if there are any further questions, I will be very happy to answer them by you contacting me in my email. Thank you very much, and that brings us to the end of the webinar. Goodbye.